I used to believe there would always be a place for me in my children's lives. That belief died last Christmas. I had walked through the snow with my arms full of gifts, each one wrapped with care, my heart beating with the quiet hope that family could heal anything. But when my son opened the door, there was no smile, no welcome, only the sharp sting of his words. "You're not on the list." Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, catching in my hair and melting on my cheeks. Around me, the street felt alive with holiday cheer. Strings of white lights traced the edges of rooftops, wreaths hung from every door, and I could hear the faint chime of carols coming from somewhere down the block. A few neighbors stood chatting on front porches with steaming mugs in their hands, and I offered polite nods as I passed. The walkway to Jason's front steps had been cleared, the dark pavement wet from salt. Through the large front window, I caught the glow of warm light, the flicker of a fire, and the shapes of people moving about. My heart gave a small, nervous flutter. It had been months since I'd seen my son or his family in person. I imagined the kids Emma and Noah tearing into their presents, their little voices carrying that high-pitched excitement only children have on Christmas Day. I thought of the hugs, the quick kiss on the cheek from Jason, the polite hello from Erica. It wasn't perfect, but it was family. I climbed the steps and paused to smooth my hair, then balanced the bag against my knee and rang the bell. The chime echoed inside and I heard footsteps. The door swung open to reveal Jason standing there in a dark suit jacket over a crisp white shirt, no tie, his hair neatly combed. For a heartbeat, he just stared at me. His eyes, the same shade of brown as his father's, didn't soften. His jaw tightened. "You're not on the list," he said evenly. The words hit me like ice water down my back. I blinked, sure I'd misheard. Behind him, the music and chatter in the house dimmed as though the walls themselves were listening. I became aware of faces turning toward the doorway. A man in a red sweater holding a wine glass glanced over a woman in a sequined blouse, paused mid-laugh. I could feel their curiosity prickling against my skin. Jason's gaze didn't waver. "You're not on the list, Mom," he repeated, his voice clipped, leaving no room for confusion. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The weight of the bag dug into my palm, but I didn't shift it. I was suddenly aware of how the cold air wrapped around my ankles, how the smell of roasted meat and cinnamon drifted from inside so close I could almost step into it. I managed finally, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "Well, I thought dinner was at 3. Jason's expression didn't change. "This is a private gathering," he said, glancing over his shoulder toward the room behind him. "We can talk later." The silence between us stretched taut and thin. Somewhere in the house, a child's voice called out, "Daddy," but Jason didn't move to let me in. The heat from inside didn't reach me, though. I stood just inches away from it. My cheeks burned not from the cold, but from the eyes watching the understanding dawning in them that I had been turned away. Jason's hand tightened on the edge of the door. "Merry Christmas," he said, the words mechanical. Then he stepped back, and the door closed firmly, shutting out the light, the warmth and the scent of everything I had once called home. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood grain, the brass of the handle, listening to the muffled sound of voices and clinking glasses resume. The bag in my hand seemed heavier now, as though every ounce of wrapping paper and ribbon was laced with lead. My feet felt rooted to the spot, but the cold pressed in, forcing me to turn. I walked slowly down the steps, my boots crunching against the thin layer of snow that had settled since I'd arrived. The street felt different now. The cheerful lights and music seemed almost mocking. I passed the same neighbors, but this time their conversations hushed as I approached. I kept my head high, my face still the way you do when dignity is the only thing keeping you upright. At the end of the block, I stopped and shifted the bag to my other hand. My breath rose in visible puffs, steady but shallow, and I began to walk toward the corner where the bus would take me back into the city. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the subway station, the damp cold had worked its way through my boots and into my bones. I stepped inside the glass shelter, the hiss of a train in the distance, mixing with the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. The bag of gifts sat at my feet, its cheerful red and green paper crumpled at the corners. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared at the tiled wall across the tracks, but my mind was far from Cambridge. It was late summer in 2005 when I stood in the small hospital room holding my husband's hand for the last time. Jason was 17, then tall and restless, already talking about how Boston University would be his ticket to something bigger. Claire was 14, all elbows and ambition, her room a mess of textbooks and dance shoes. We were a family of 4 in a weathered colonial in Portland, Maine, with a future we thought we could plan. His death left a hole I didn't have the luxury to fall into. 2 teenagers needed someone steady, and that someone had to be me. I went back to the hospital where I'd worked for years, picking up double shifts and sometimes sleeping in the on-call room between them. The other nurses would joke about my coffee intake, but no one saw me calculating bills in my head while changing IV bags. Every paycheck had to stretch. The mortgage, Jason's tuition, Claire's after-school programs. I learned how to fix a leaky faucet myself, rather than call a plumber, kept the same aging sedan running with duct tape and prayer, and cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept us afloat. Jason got into Boston University with a partial scholarship, and I covered the rest. I drove him down in that old car, the trunk crammed with boxes, pretending not to notice how eager he was to be rid of me so he could start his life. Claire followed a few years later to the University of Illinois, another set of tuition bills I tackled without complaint. When the opportunity came to buy a small condo in Florida at a foreclosure price, a place that could have been my winter escape, I let it pass. The kids came first, always. Somewhere along the way, the direct deposits started. At first it was small, a few hundred here and there to help Jason with his first apartment, to help Claire furnish hers. Then it became a fixed amount, $1,200 to each of them every month. 10 years of that automatically withdrawn, no questions asked. I told myself it was so they wouldn't struggle like I had, that it would give them breathing room. I didn't notice how it made me invisible except when the money showed up. The rumble of an arriving train pulled me back. I boarded, slid into a seat by the window, and watched the dark tunnel walls blur past. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I hesitated before pulling it out. Diane's name lit the screen. "Are you okay?" Simple words, but I could hear her voice in my head, that mix of concern and the unspoken, I knew something like this could happen. I typed back, "I will be," and left it at that. There was no way to explain what it felt like to be shut out so deliberately, not just from a house, but from the circle of your own family. The train rocked gently, the warm air inside, making me drowsy. Outside the windows, the darkness gave way to glimpses of the city, the glint of streetlights on wet pavement. When I reached the stop near my hotel, I stepped out into the wind again, the bag of gifts swinging at my side. I wondered what I would do with them now. Leave them at the front desk for donation, maybe? The idea of bringing them back to Maine and looking at them every day was unbearable. I walked slowly toward the lobby, passing a couple arm in arm, their laughter carried off by the gusts. In my room, I set the bag down in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence was thick. I toed off my boots and stretched my sore feet, staring at the city skyline through the window. Somewhere out there, Jason's house was glowing with light, his guests laughing, plates being passed around. I tried to imagine the conversation, how he might explain my absence, if he even would. My phone buzzed again, this time a photo from Diane of the Christmas tree at her place, lights twinkling against the dark windows. Beneath it, she'd written, "Wish you were here." I swallowed the lump in my throat and set the phone face down on the nightstand. I would call her tomorrow. Tonight I didn't have the words. Tonight there was only the hum of the radiator, the faint sound of a siren in the distance, and the ache in my chest that told me something had shifted for good. I thought about the last time Jason had invited me over without me asking first, and I couldn't remember when that was. Most of our visits in recent years had been on neutral ground, a coffee shop halfway between Portland and Boston, or a quick lunch if he happened to be in town for work. Whenever I suggested stopping by his place, there was always a reason it wasn't a good time. The kids were sick, they were in the middle of remodeling, or they had company staying in the guest room. After a while, I stopped suggesting it, as often telling myself they were busy, telling myself I didn't want to intrude. Erica had a knack for throwing elaborate parties. I would see the photos she posted online, tables draped in white linens, candles, flickering trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Everyone seemed to be there except me. Her parents were in nearly every shot, her cousins, her friends from the events industry. It was clear she knew how to make space when she wanted to, and just as clear when she didn't. I told myself it wasn't personal, but it was hard to believe that when she was capable of organizing events for hundreds of people, yet couldn't find a chair for me at her own dining table. One afternoon last spring, I had stopped by Boston unexpectedly after a medical conference. I thought it would be nice to see Jason for a quick coffee before heading home. He was in the middle of a phone call when I arrived at his office lobby, pacing near the window with his back to me. His voice was tight, lower than usual, and I caught fragments about numbers not adding up and someone needing to buy more time. Before I could process what I was hearing, he turned and saw me. His expression shifted instantly. He ended the call mid-sentence, sliding the phone into his pocket with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. We never talked about what I had overheard, and I let it go. But the tension in his shoulders that day stayed with me. Looking back, I see now how often he deflected when the subject of work came up. He would answer in vague terms, say everything was fine, then quickly pivot to asking about the weather in Maine or how Diane was doing. It was a habit, and Erica had it too. She was always cheerful, always quick to change the subject if conversations veered anywhere uncomfortable. When I asked about the kids' school or extracurriculars, she would light up. But if I asked about their finances or their schedules, she would laugh it off and say they were managing. It wasn't until much later that I realized managing was just another word for covering something up. There was a Thanksgiving 2 years ago that stood out in my mind. I had invited them to my place in Portland. They declined, saying they had promised to host Erica's family instead. I offered to bring a dish to help cook, even to just drop by for dessert. Jason's voice had gone distant over the phone the way it did when he was trying to wrap things up. He said it would be a full house, that maybe we could do something just the three of us another time. That other time never came. Little by little, those missed opportunities had stacked up. Birthdays acknowledged with a text instead of a visit. Holidays spent apart, conversations that skimmed the surface but never went deep. I had convinced myself it was normal that adult children grew busy with their own lives, but there was a difference between being busy and building a wall. The radiator in the hotel room clicked and hummed as I pulled the throw blanket from the foot of the bed around my shoulders. My phone sat silent on the nightstand, now the earlier flurry of messages and photos replaced by a stillness that felt both heavy and oddly peaceful. I thought about calling Diane back, telling her more, but the idea of saying it out loud was exhausting. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water from the carafe by the TV and stood at the window looking down at the quiet street below. In the glow of a street lamp, a man walked his dog, the animal's breath puffing white in the cold. I wondered if Jason was still entertaining his guests, if Erica was topping off wine glasses and laughing at jokes. I wondered if they noticed the empty space where I should have been. I stayed there until the dog and its owner disappeared from view, then let the curtain fall back into place. There was no undoing the night, no erasing the way those words had sounded in Jason's voice. But the memory of that phone call in the lobby months ago stirred something in me. It was the first crack in the image I had of his life, the first sign that what they presented to the world might not be the full story. I didn't know yet how deep that crack went, but I had a feeling it would matter. The hotel room was warm but felt hollow, as if the heat could not quite fill the space. I pulled the chair closer to the window and sat there watching the snow fall in slow, deliberate swirls under the glow of the streetlight. The city outside was muffled, and still the kind of quiet that only comes on a winter holiday night. I could still see Jason's face in my mind, the controlled expression, the way his eyes had stayed flat while he spoke to me at the door. That image kept looping back like a song you can't get out of your head. My laptop sat on the small desk by the bed, the black screen reflecting a faint outline of my face. I hesitated before opening it, my hands resting on the edge, as if they were waiting for permission from some part of me I could no longer hear. Then I pushed back the lid, and the screen lit up. The familiar login screen appeared, and muscle memory carried me the rest of the way. A few keystrokes and clicks, and I was staring at the bank dashboard I had not looked at closely in months. The numbers sat there cold and undeniable. My eyes scanned down the page to the scheduled transfers, the ones set to leave my account like clockwork on the first of each month. $1,200 to Jason, $1,200 to Claire. I thought about the years of doing it without question, without pause, telling myself it was just what a mother did. My fingers hovered over the touchpad, then moved with a steadiness I didn't entirely expect. One by one, I selected each transfer and canceled it. The confirmation windows popped up in sequence, each asking if I was sure. I clicked yes every time. When the last one disappeared from the schedule, I leaned back in the chair. The balance in my account looked larger than I remembered, the absence of those monthly withdrawals already visible. A strange mixture of lightness and unease washed over me. It was not joy exactly, but there was a release in it, a loosening of a weight I had been carrying for so long I had stopped noticing. The snow outside was falling harder now, blurring the outlines of the buildings across the street. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand. I ignored it. A few seconds later, it buzzed again. Then again. The sound was insistent, each vibration a small thud against the wood. I stood and walked over, glancing at the screen. Jason's name filled it, his photo from years ago when he still smiled easily. I let it go to voicemail. Almost immediately it lit up again, this time with Claire's name. I let that one pass too. I set the phone down, face up, and returned to the chair. The screen lit up over and over, sometimes with one name, sometimes the other. I could almost imagine their voices if I answered. Jason's controlled but tight with frustration, Claire's starting soft, then sharpening with each sentence. I stayed still, hands folded in my lap, watching the snowfall thicken into a curtain of white. The buzzing became background noise, a steady pulse I could tune out. For the first time in years, I realized I did not have to pick up. I did not have to explain, to justify, to absorb whatever they needed to unload. I could simply let the calls come and go the way the snowflakes drifted past the window, falling whether I noticed them or not. After a while, the buzzing stopped. The room was quiet again, except for the faint hum of the heating unit and the occasional creak of the building settling in the cold. I closed the laptop and slid it to the far end of the desk. My eyes were heavy, but sleep felt far away. Instead, I sat there and watched until the glass fogged faintly from my breath, the snow piling along the edges of the sidewalk, the streetlights casting halos in the night. The gray light of morning crept into the room, pale and cold against the carpet. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and saw the screen crowded with notifications. Messages stacked on top of one another, each preview line a variation of urgency. Jason's name filled most of them. The first one read, "I need to talk to you right now." Another said, "Emma's tuition is due this week." One came in at nearly 3 a.m. telling me Noah's next round of therapy starts Monday and they could lose his spot if payment was late. Mixed among them were messages from Claire. Hers started with Mom. "I really need your help," and moved quickly into specifics. "The baby's due in March and there are still things we don't have." She listed a crib, a car seat, a breast pump, as if the itemization itself might convince me. By the end of her list, the words had shifted. "You know how expensive this is. You can't just cut us off without warning." I scrolled slowly, my thumb moving over the glass. Each sentence had its own edge. Jason's carried a clipped impatience, like a man already on the brink. Claire's oscillated between pleading and accusing. Then came one from Jason that stopped me. "If no one helps me, I'm going under." His words sat there stark and final, the kind of thing you say when you want to make someone else feel the weight of it. I set the phone down on the duvet and went to the small coffee maker on the counter. The water gurgled as it heated, filling the air with the faint, bitter scent. The motions were automatic, the paper packet torn open the stream of liquid into the thin cup. I carried it back to the bed and took a sip, the heat settling into my chest. The phone buzzed again. Another from Jason. "We are not going to make it without you." The follow-up came seconds later. "No one helps, we lose everything." The temptation to type something back tugged at me. Not to explain or justify, just to stop the constant hammering. Instead, I lifted the phone and typed 5 words. "I need time for myself." I pressed send and watched the bubble appear in our thread. The response was almost immediate. Jason's came first. "Time for yourself. This is not about you." Claire's followed. "Wow. Just wow." I put the phone face down and walked to the window. The snow from the night before had been plowed into uneven banks along the street. The sidewalks a mix of ice and slush. A man in a navy coat passed by pulling a red wagon with a bundled child inside. The scene was ordinary quiet, untouched by the storm brewing in my messages. The phone buzzed again. "Jason, longer this time. You have no idea what kind of pressure I'm under. This job is the only thing keeping us afloat, and I am barely hanging on. If I lose it, we are done." His words were heavier now, laced with something close to desperation. I read them twice, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility creep in, the instinct to patch the hole before it sank the boat. I closed my eyes and took a long breath, holding it until my lungs ached. When I opened them, the room felt smaller. The cup in my hand had gone lukewarm. I set it on the desk and sat in the chair staring at the closed laptop. I could log back in and reverse what I had done the night before in less than a minute. One click and the transfers would be back in place, the storm would settle and the old rhythm would return. But so would the wait. So would the knowing that nothing had changed. The buzzing slowed after that, replaced by the occasional ping of an incoming email. I ignored them all. The hotel hallway was quiet when I stepped out, the carpet muffling my steps. Downstairs in the lobby, a small tree stood in the corner, its ornaments catching the light from the tall windows. I passed it without stopping, and pushed through the glass doors into the cold air. My boots crunched on the salted sidewalk each step, taking me further from the noise I had chosen to leave unanswered. Jason called just after noon and told me he was nearby. His voice was tight but steady, the kind that gave away nothing until it wanted to. He suggested we meet at a coffee shop around the corner from the hotel. I agreed, not because I wanted to, but because I was tired of hearing his name light up my phone. The shop was busy, the windows fogged from the contrast of cold air outside and the heat from the espresso machines inside. I spotted him immediately standing near the counter with his hands shoved in his coat pockets. He didn't smile when I approached. We took a table by the window, the snow outside now a dirty slush along the curb. He leaned forward as soon as we sat down. "You embarrassed me," he said flatly. Erica was mortified. "All our friends were there and you showed up uninvited." I wrapped my hands around the paper cup in front of me, feeling the heat seep into my skin. I told him calmly that I had been invited, or at least led to believe I was. "Dinner at 3, those were his exact words in the text. If there was embarrassment, it came from the way he chose to handle it, not from my presence. He shook his head. "You should have known it wasn't the right day. You could have called first." I let him speak, watching the way his jaw worked as if he were chewing the words before spitting them out. Then he sat back and exhaled through his nose. "Look, we can make sure this never happens again. I can put you on the guest list for family events, but you need to start the transfers again." The words settled between us like a brick. I took a slow sip of coffee and set the cup down. "So, it's conditional," I said. "My place in your life is tied to a monthly payment." "That's not what I'm saying," he replied quickly, but the flicker in his eyes told me otherwise. "It's about avoiding misunderstandings. We need consistency and we need your help." I shook my head. "No, Jason. What you need is to figure out how to stand on your own without expecting me to carry you." For a moment, his expression hardened into something unfamiliar. He looked away toward the street where a man was scraping ice from his windshield. When he turned back, his voice was lower. "Things are not good at work, Mom. We're under federal review. There are auditors in the building every day going through everything. If I lose this job, I lose everything. I felt a pulse of recognition from months earlier, the tension I had overheard in his phone call at the office lobby. I stayed quiet, letting him fill the silence. He went on about how long he had been there, how much he had invested in the company, how unfair it was that one bad quarter could put everything at risk. When he finally stopped, I told him I was sorry for the stress he was under, but that my decision about the transfers stood. His eyes searched mine, looking for a crack, a place to wedge in the guilt that used to work so well. There was none. The noise of the coffee shop swelled around us, the hiss of steam, the clatter of cups. He leaned back in his chair, his shoulders tight, and stared at the table for a long time. I waited, my hands folded loosely around the warm cup, the heat a small anchor in the middle of the cold space between us. That night back in my hotel room, my phone lit up with an incoming video call from Claire. I considered letting it ring out, but something in me wanted to see her face. She appeared on the screen with dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She skipped any pleasantries and got straight to the point. "Mom, I think we should talk about the condo in Florida." I stayed silent, waiting. She leaned closer to the camera, her voice taking on that coaxing tone she used when she wanted something. "If we could use it for a couple of months after the baby comes, it would save us so much money. We could get out of Chicago for a while, away from the cold, give the baby some fresh air. Daniel could work remotely and we'd cover utilities. It would help us get ahead without you having to give us cash." I let her finish before I answered. "Claire, the condo is part of my retirement plan. It's not something I can just loan out or sell right now." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "So, you're saying no?" "I'm saying it's not available," I replied evenly. She leaned back, shaking her head. "You've helped us for years, and now when we actually need you, you're holding back. It's selfish." I felt the words settle like a stone in my chest, but I didn't flinch. Before I could respond, Daniel's voice came from somewhere off-screen. "Claire, let me talk to her." He moved into view, sitting beside her. His expression was tired but calmer. "Hi, Maggie, I know this isn't ideal. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way this is coming across. We'll figure something else out." Claire glanced at him sharply, but he kept going. "We appreciate everything you've done. I'll pick up extra shifts if I have to. We'll manage." I nodded, feeling a small measure of relief at his tone. "Thank you, Daniel. I know you will." Claire crossed her arms, looking away. "So that's it then. No condo, no help." I kept my voice steady. "I'm focusing on making sure my future is secure, just like you're trying to secure yours. That's what being responsible looks like." Daniel gave me a slight nod, the kind that said he understood more than he was willing to say aloud. I could see the tension between them in the way she leaned away from him, the way his shoulders slumped. We ended the call without any promises, and the screen went dark. I set the phone on the nightstand and sat for a while in the quiet, the muted city lights filtering through the curtains. The conversation replayed in my head, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something I had started to suspect. The rules had changed, and I was no longer playing the same role they had assigned me. The next morning I called Diane. Her voice was warm the moment she picked up, and I didn't bother easing into the conversation. I told her everything from the slammed door on Christmas to the calls and the meeting with Jason, all the way to Claire's request about the condo. She didn't interrupt, just listened the occasional sound of her breathing, letting me know she was still there. When I finished, there was a short silence before she spoke. "You did the right thing, Maggie. Cutting them off was the only way they'll ever stand on their own." I exhaled, feeling lighter for having said it all aloud. Diane's tone softened. "You've spent decades giving to everyone else. Maybe it's time you start giving to yourself. Take a trip. Go somewhere you've always wanted to see." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. "Bra-sint." By the end of the week, I had booked appointments with a lawyer and a financial advisor. We sat in a polished conference room while they explained the process of selling the condo in Florida. The lawyer went over the paperwork, title transfer, and the state-specific requirements. The financial advisor walked me through tax implications and how to protect the proceeds. There was a clear plan, and for the first time in years, it was built entirely around my needs. The sale closed in late January. I signed the last document, slid the pen across the table, and felt something like relief rush through me. A few days later, the proceeds hit my account. I moved a portion into a travel fund earmarked for places I had only ever seen in magazines. The rest went into a high-yield savings account, secure and untouchable, except by me. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and booked a flight to Tokyo for February. The idea of wandering through markets tasting food I couldn't pronounce and standing beneath cherry trees in winter filled me with a kind of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. After Japan, I would head to Thailand, then spend spring drifting through parts of Europe I had only traced with my finger on a map. It didn't take long for the news to reach Jason and Claire. The first call came from Jason, his voice sharp before I even said hello. "So you sold it?" Just like that. No discussion. "It was mine to sell," I said. Claire's message arrived minutes later. "I can't believe you would take away something that could have helped both of us. We could have used it for years." I read them both twice, then set the phone down without answering. I looked instead at the confirmation email for my flight, the clean lines of the itinerary, the seat number printed neatly in black. Outside the window, the street was quiet under a pale winter sky, and for the first time in a long while, the horizon felt open. From the narrow balcony of my hotel room in Kyoto, I checked my email while the city below stirred awake. There was one from Diane with the subject line, "You won't believe this." She wrote that Jason had sold his luxury car and the cabin in Vermont. The proceeds barely covered his legal fees and the debts that had been piling up since the investigation at his firm began. She added that Erica had lost a major contract after a client pulled out, not wanting to be associated with the mess. A few days later, another email from Diane arrived, this one shorter. Claire and Daniel had moved into a smaller apartment in Chicago. Daniel had taken on extra hours at work, and Claire was looking for part-time opportunities she could do from home once the baby arrived. Diane's words were matter of fact, but I could feel the undercurrent of sympathy for them even as she reminded me that none of it was my responsibility. In Bangkok, after a long day of walking through temples and markets, I opened my laptop and found a message from Daniel himself. He didn't ask for money. Instead, he explained that Claire had a short-term project in Portland, starting in the summer, and they wondered if they could stay at my house in Maine for a few weeks to save on rent. He made a point of saying they would handle their own expenses. I read the email twice before responding. I told him they could use the house, but only on the understanding that it was temporary and that I would not be providing any financial support. His reply came the next day. "Thank you, Maggie. We'll take good care of it." In the quiet of my hotel room, I leaned back in the chair and let the hum of the air conditioner fill the space. The decisions I had made over the past few months had shifted something fundamental. The patterns that had once seemed unbreakable were loosening, and the weight I used to carry for everyone else no longer sat on my shoulders. Outside the window, the city lights reflected in the river, a reminder that the world was larger than the small battles I had been fighting for years. The streets of Lisbon shimmered in the afternoon light, the kind that made the cobblestones look like they had been dusted with gold. I was sitting at a cafe terrace, a small pastel de nata cooling on the plate in front of me when my phone buzzed. It was an email from Daniel. The subject line was simple: "For you." I tapped it open and a video filled the screen. Lily, now with a full head of dark curls, was toddling across a living room floor, her tiny arms outstretched toward the camera. Daniel's voice came from behind the lens, warm and steady. "Good job, sweetheart. Now say hi to Grandma." Lily stopped, wobbled, then broke into a grin that made my chest ache in the best way. At the end of the clip, Daniel's voice lowered. "Thank you for giving us the chance to change." I sat back in my chair, letting the sounds of the cafe fade behind me. My mind drifted to the Christmas morning a year ago, standing in the cold outside Jason's door, the weight of the gift bag cutting into my fingers, the sting of his words settling in my chest. Back then, I thought I was losing something permanent. I hadn't realized I was clearing space for something better. Travel had stretched the edges of my life in ways I hadn't expected. I had walked through Tokyo's quiet shrines in winter, tasted fruit so sweet in Thailand. It felt like sunlight in my mouth, and watched spring arrive in Paris along the Seine. Each place had left a mark not just in photos or souvenirs, but in the way I now carried myself. I no longer measured my worth in what I could give away. Jason's life had shifted too. I still heard bits and pieces from Diane. He was working again, though, in a smaller firm and living without the things he once insisted he couldn't do without. Erica had taken on a new line of work, quieter, steadier. We spoke on occasion cautiously, like people learning a new language together. Claire and Daniel seemed different, as well, lighter somehow. There was gratitude in their voices when we spoke, not expectation. The sky above the city began to soften toward evening, the tiled rooftops catching the last of the day's sun. I closed the video of Lily and slipped the phone back into my bag. The gift I had given myself was not just freedom from financial strain, but the freedom to choose who and what I allowed into my life. I finished my coffee and let my eyes wander over the narrow streets, the laundry strung between windows, the sound of laughter drifting from a group of students passing by. Life was still complicated, still imperfect, but it was mine to navigate on my own terms. I had arrived with gifts on Christmas, and I had left with freedom. Sometimes the most important list is the one you keep for yourself, the list of people you allow to stay in your life. If you have lived through a moment that made you rethink your place in your own family, I would love to hear your story. Share it in the comments, and if you want to hear more stories like mine, subscribe so we can keep walking through them together.